All right. I'm excited to be here today with my new friend, Helen Sartory. So, Helen is the Chief Revenue Officer at Beatport. She oversees DJ and producer brands, including Beatport, Plugin Boutique, and Loop Cloud. She's a music tech innovator. She's a former GM of the Rattle LA, incubating music tech startups, advising AI music search startup Feed Forward. And she also brings expertise from a decade of investment banking at Greenhill and Company and Lazard to her roles in the music industry. So she's sort of in this cross section between tech and music. And so I'm excited to connect with her today to talk a little bit about the current landscape for indie musicians. And right now, what are some of the pros and cons of being independent versus signing to a record label? And what are some of the platforms that are available to be able to help indie artists to be able to be successful in today's day and age? So Helen, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the episode today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So maybe to kick things off, for anyone who this is their first time meeting you or connecting with you, could you share a little bit of an introduction into your story and how you came to join Beatport, kind of the main problem that you're here to solve?
Sure. I'll go all the way back to when I was a kid and I was 12 and I decided that I wanted to be a film score composer and that was my dream. So I started down the route of quite a boring classical music kind of vibe for a long time. I ended up studying music at quite an old-fashioned university, thinking I was going to go there and learn how to run a studio and, compose modern music. And actually what I learned was how to write a fugue and a string quartet and a lot of things that are not so useful for being a modern musician. So I ended up pivoting on my way out of university, did like a mini MBA, ended up in investment banking, which was a whole other experience. But what it did do was introduce me into kind of the tech startup world. I was based out in San Francisco for a few years where I was looking at early stage, high growth tech startups. And around that time, also, I started being asked to write music again. So I was doing a bit of writing for theater and short films and things like that. And I finally, got around to doing things like learning how to use Ableton and, do electronic music production, which is something I'd never tackled before. And when I really got the bug to get back into music was when I kind of got introduced to the music industry for the first time. And as someone coming from a finance background, it made kind of no sense to me whatsoever. I was seeing these record contracts that essentially, if there was a mortgage, it would be like taking out a mortgage, paying back the mortgage, and then still not owning the house. And it made no sense to me. I was like, why would anybody ever sign these things? Why can't we invest in musicians and artists the same way that we invest in tech startups? Do kind of equity-based investment that doesn't involve the copyright or having creative control or all the other things that we load up on artists just because they're artists, when really we should be thinking of them more founders of their own companies. So I had my own little music project going at the time that I was kind of touring as a live thing that I've mostly managed to scrub from the internet now because it was not very high quality, but I was introduced to a couple of guys who were starting the Rattle, which was, that it was designed as an incubator for independent artists and music tech startups together, giving artists a bit of an education around different types of financial investment that they could take if they didn't necessarily want to go down the major label route or the label route at all. We opened a site in London, and then I moved over to LA in 2019 to open a site there in Silver Lake. We had a great community of artists and tech startups all kind of working together to share knowledge, share tools, and kind of work around the kind of existing frameworks in the music industry to explore different economic kind of arrangements and things like that. Ultimately, it was somewhat affected by COVID. That was one of the sad things of building this amazing kind of community studio to have independent artists come through and use and then have to immediately close it down was very sad. But I still stayed out there for a couple of years doing a lot of work remotely with emerging artists and startups to see if we could make music a viable career without necessarily having to go down the label route. I moved back to the UK 2022 and got the call from Beatport at that point. And I'd been out of kind of dance music specifically for a while. At that time, I'd gone kind of cross-genre. But when I met with Rob, the CEO, and he explained how they were growing the business, it was super interesting to me. So essentially, what some people might be familiar with the original Beatport, which was started out in 2004 as, a download store where DJs get music. And we still do run the download store. It's I think, the only place in the world where downloads as a product are growing every year. But we've added a lot since then. So we also have a DSP for streaming. We have the Beat Source catalog, which is an open format product for different genres that are not necessarily within like EDM. But we also run a few producer companies, Plugin Boutique, some people may be aware of, Loop Cloud and Loop Masters, which are both sample marketplaces. And we also run a distribution company called Suite and a demo submission tool called Label Radar. So Beatport now is actually like a group of several companies that are kind of like a vertical slice of the music industry, all kind of focused on dance music. And that was a really interesting kind of approach for me because it meant that I could kind of see where everything plugs in together. So yeah, I came on board about 2.5 years ago, initially to head up kind of product strategy for them. And then the role kind of progressed from there. And now I'm, Chief Revenue Officer. So the joke is that I have to make all the charts go up to the right. That's my job. So that was a bit of a ramble, but that's kind of how we got to where we are today.
Awesome. That's fantastic. And I mean, chief revenue officer, I mean, that's an important role, like for a business, like, revenue is sort of like the oxygen or the lifeblood. That's like fundamental to the service that you're providing. Okay. That's super interesting. Kind of hearing your background and how you came from investments and looking at the existing infrastructure. We're like what's going on here? Like, this seems kind of wild in terms of some of the deals compared to things like a mortgage. And yeah, I'm curious, with that perspective and with what you know now with the artists that you've worked with, how do you view the current landscape of the music industry as it relates to independent artists and record labels? Do you think that we're in for like a time of reckoning where there's like huge disruption? Or how do you see the role of record label evolving, from what it used to be? Just curious to hear your general thoughts based on your perspective coming into this from an investor.
Okay, a big question. I think, and I'm talking about this and thinking about this every day, and it's constantly changing. But yeah, we are at quite an interesting period of change for the music industry. Some ways are really exciting. I do think the accessibility these days for good independent talent to be able to reach through is really exciting. But at the same time, we've built a lot of problems, right? The kind of complete opening of the floodgates to anybody who has a music generator of any kind to be able to kind of flood the system with low quality music is making it really, really difficult for what was designed as a way for high quality DIY artists to cut through. I think the reaction from that is, naturally the major labels are looking at ways to protect their market share. I would love to say that there are ways to do that by growing the whole pie, not just by fighting over the existing pie. But sometimes that's not how it seems like some of these conversations are going. I think one of the good things that's happened is that we're seeing much less of these really big 360 deals where, ultimately it's very unlikely that the artist is going to have a good outcome, and a bit more flexibility in the type of deals you can negotiate. But on the other side, I think labels are doing, some of the bigger labels are doing much less work in terms of developing artists from an early stage. You're kind of expected to arrive fully formed. And if you haven't had a hit within your first 3, then you're kind of out. So I don't know. I was kind of avoiding saying, is it better or worse? I think in some ways it's better, and in other ways it's worse. I think what it has been clear is that you no longer need that stamp of approval from a major label to have a success. It is really hard to do it as a pure DIY, but I think there's definitely more of a halfway house now. There is smaller labels, there's one-person labels that are doing really well. There's kind of distribution deals or label services deals where you can kind of chop and change and kind of pay for what you need from a label and not pay for all the stuff you don't really need from a label. So there's definitely more flexibility out there. Do I think it's any easier to make it than it was? Probably not. In some ways, we've made it a lot more complicated. I think, yeah. I don't know if I answered the question, but those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's super helpful. So it sounds like, in some ways it feels like it's moved in the right direction for indies, and that it's more accessible than ever to be able to record, distribute your music, use the internet, social media to put it out. But on the same token, it's open up the floodgates where there's more music than ever. It's easier to make music. That's led to a lot of saturation. It becomes harder to cut through. Record labels now are sort of expecting that you come in somewhat fully formed. And because of that, they do less of the initial artist development. And you're kind of on your own trying to figure out, how do I establish an identity that can cut through the noise and kind of build that initial foundation, which, might lead into a good next question, which is, for the majority of indie artists who are here right now, who haven't signed to a record label and are kind of in that stage where maybe we're kind of getting fully formed and haven't had a breakthrough yet in terms of a saturated market, do you have any recommendations or thoughts or strategies that they might think about in order to help them cut through?
Yeah, so in my last role, I worked a lot with DIY artists who were at that exact stage. They had a really interesting idea. Like, we were quite selective in the incubator. We had to feel like there was something unique and authentic about an artist if we were going to invite them into the process. But that by itself doesn't necessarily resonate, right? You've got to find your tribe. You've got to find a place where whatever you're selling, people want to buy. We were looking at kind of interesting guerrilla tactics to try and get acts out there without necessarily having to compete in the major channels. Because I think there's a misconception now that if you pay for playlisting and you opt in for discovery mode and you do all these kind of like digital things to try and get your music out there in front of a lot of ears, then you'll have a result. And I think what we experienced was that, yes, you could potentially generate a lot of streams that way, but like that in itself doesn't really mean anything or paying your bills. It wasn't necessarily translating into, are people going to come see your show and buy your t-shirt and, sign up to your newsletter and like all the things that you want from an engaged fan base.
The kind of thing that a chief revenue officer is like, hey guys, like, look, we're missing the point here.
You want that recurring revenue. Yeah. So I'm not saying I don't advocate artists do all those things, but I don't think by themselves that's a release plan. Where we saw really interesting results was when artists were focusing much more on a small engaged audience. It may be really just their local area, playing live regularly. I was amazed at how many artists that I would meet that would have ostensibly had like big streaming hits and have never done a live show, like because they've had this purely digital kind of experience of blowing up. Is a real big problem because you need to, in most genres, be able to kind of fill that need for your fan base. So some of the artists we worked with would kind of religiously play whenever they could in their local area, even if it was to like 20 people, because they were getting that experience. And in the lockdown, we were able to then translate that into a live stream kind of experience because they were more comfortable with, doing their live performance. We were doing things like making, instead of a music video, making a video game that had the music kind of playing in the background to kind of test out this idea. Like, if you get someone to listen to your song 6 times in a row, it's going to kind of earworm its way into it. One of the ways to do that is to play it whilst they're doing something else. So creating like an experience around the music that's more than just, getting it into a playlist on Spotify, for example. That was when we were kind of launching artists in the middle of COVID and trying to think like, what can you do digitally to like stand out from the crowd? But yeah, I mean, in terms of how we do it now with Beatport, is kind of interesting because dance music has a slightly different structure to it. And essentially what we do at Beatport is we get music into the hands of DJs. So if you think about the average like stream on Spotify is more than likely going to someone in their car or somebody, in the gym. The average song on Beatport is being played out to a crowd, right? It's being curated by the DJs. And I think it's something that people forget a lot if they're making dance music, or, we would call it music that you dance to, because that's actually, I think they say 80% of music is the music that you dance to, even if only 16% is technically dance music. Making sure that you've got a solid plan for how to get it into the hands of DJs that are going to resonate with it and give you feedback, because they are that kind of like power listener, active listener that is auditioning like 1,000 tracks a week to figure out what they want, what's going to resonate with their audiences. So it's been really interesting making that move from kind of a cross-genre kind of job into a dance music specific job, because the roots in are so different. But it does mean that you're able to launch as an artist on a much lower budget. Most kind of new dance outfits, like, you don't even need to do a music video, but you've got to get like decent cover art, very good mastering. But essentially, if you can get your music out there with DJs that resonate with it, they will be your free promotion tool. So one of the things we do at Beatport is we have something called the hype charts. So separate from the main Beatport charts, we run a separate chart, which is you can opt into as a label, or I think you can do it. You can't do this as a DIY artist, but if you're a one-person label, you can do it. As long as you earn less than, I think, $15,000 on the Beatport store, you're eligible for the hype charts. And that allows us to create visibility for really good up-and-coming indie music in a place where it doesn't have to necessarily compete with the major label stuff, with the big marketing budgets behind it. So I think looking for places like that where like there's a space created specifically for you and your type of music at your level, when we've got an audience of DJs specifically looking for that kind of stuff, is really helpful in a place where we try and accelerate talent and make sure that we're getting it to the next level.
Awesome. So what I'm hearing is that one of the biggest challenges that you see an artist struggling with is just around like monetization with their music, because they're showing up in places where they're paid a fraction of a penny, per stream, and the people who are listening to it might be listening in the background, and a listen isn't necessarily equal to a listen or to getting a stream from a DJ where there's actually like an influencer market to it. One question that I think might be helpful is related to just general mindset around revenue and money for artists. I think as artists, in a lot of cases, we have a bit of a mindset block or resistance or fear around this idea of making money or quote unquote selling out. And so I would love to hear your perspective. And for any artist who's here who's deep, like they know that they need to make money and they want to make money, but maybe they feel a little bit embarrassed about it, or they don't want to be seen as that, and might have some mindset blocks around revenue generation.
I definitely resonate with that and have had a lot of artists talk to me about this feeling of like a slight disconnect between, am I still a real artist if like I want to make money and I want to be successful? And I think firstly I would say like there's room for every type of personality in artistry. I don't think you have to think one way or another about anything, especially money, to be a good artist. But I would say that I think there's a bit of a trope that has not been helpful for the artist community, that some way not authentic as an artist if you're thinking about how to generate income. And the cynic in me thinks, well, that's because the people that benefit from you not caring about making money are usually the people that taking a cut from whatever deal you're doing. So my approach has always been, you shouldn't be in the music industry to make money, because quite honestly, it's not a great place to do that if that's your main goal. It's so many easier ways to be making money. But if you're in the music industry and you're a talented artist, you should expect to be able to reach a point where you can support yourself through that, and you don't need to subsidize yourself through other means, and you shouldn't be embarrassed to have that as a goal. I do think there are some boring ways that lots of artists forget that they could be making money. I'm always the boring person around the table that's trying to remind people that they need to register for publishing, they need to make sure they're collecting their PRO's money, especially in the dance music industry. It's something that I advocate for a lot. DJs should be submitting their set lists back to the venues, because otherwise the music that they're playing, like the artists that made that music, don't get paid properly. Similarly, if you are a DJ and you are sharing music out on moments from your set out on social media, like, you should be IDing the track. You should be crediting the artist that made that music if you're benefiting from it in terms of social media. There are so many ways that we could be not just generating more money as an industry, but making sure the money that is generated is getting back into the correct hands, that versus, making every single up-and-coming artist have to hustle night and day to be able to pay their bills. There are easy ways to do that. But I also think there are kind of ways to get creative about it. If there's things that are adjacent to your music career that that make you money, that can bring you joy, maybe that's a way and something to explore as well. There was an artist that we worked with who they were just great coaches. They were really creative people and they loved helping other people become creative. So one of their main income streams became running kind of writing camps or creativity camps for other people, not even necessarily musicians, but just people that wanted to be more creative in their lives. And that became a really strong income stream for them. And they were able to reinvest that back into their albums and their music videos. So it was a way to kind of take a skill that they had developed through being an artist and monetize it in a different way that wasn't necessarily reliant on spy streams or whatever it is.
Totally makes sense. Yeah. So it sounds like what you're saying is one path to consider as an artist is that you have your music, which is sort of a promotional tool to bring people into your community. But you can also think tangentially to what are some things that are aligned with your music, like doing songwriting camps or creativity. I don't know if there's a word, it's creativity clinics, but I don't think that's an actual thing, but it has a nice ring to it.
Hey, what are the ideas we were calling them? Yeah, creativity
clinic. It's kind of nice. But the idea is that these things can be in alignment, with your music and can generate, revenue that allows you to support, the music career and the music community. I'm curious if you have any advice or ideas in terms of like the making money intrinsically with music. Obviously, like the world has changed a lot in terms of music assets. We used to have cassettes and vinyls and CDs and digital downloads and streaming. And it seems like things have shifted in a way where the intrinsic value of the music itself for a lot of people isn't really the thing that is generating enough revenue to be sustainable. And now we're relying on shows and live events and supplemental kind of paths or different products or businesses, to support the music. Maybe this is a little bit of like a curveball, but do you see any path towards like NFTs sort of had, sort of a moment in the sun and then the kind of a bubble pop, for good reason, like, gifts of hamsters are not worth millions of dollars. But do you see a path for like intrinsic music assets to have value again? Or do you think that that's more something that, I think this is the new world and now we just need to focus more on music being more of a promotional asset? Or what are your thoughts in general?
So I get this question a lot, and maybe I'm an optimist or just too stubborn to agree to that second version of reality that you described, where like music has no intrinsic value and you just use it as a tool to get people into your adjacent revenue streams. Firstly, I think that's just really sad to have devalued music to such an extent when it's like such a core part of the human experience and not something we've done with almost any other art form. But also because there are structural people that really lose out in that situation. Like if you are a songwriter, but not an artist, and suddenly like all of the revenue streams move to NFTs or whatever the next thing is, for the most part, the songwriter, the publishing side is cut out of those deals because it's too difficult. It's too difficult to put publishing onto the blockchain, partly because of the complexity of the economic framework that we've inherited from the music industry. But I don't think people are trying hard enough to preserve value at all levels within the musical assets. I think we as, I know it's kind of quite boring territory that I talk about a lot, but kind of...
I love this. I don't find this boring at all.
Well, this is a lot of stuff we talk about on our like metadata roundtables, but there's a known problem, right, in royalty distribution because the metadata universe is so fragmented and inconsistent that at every kind of block of the, I'm not going to say chain, part of the supply chain, we're losing a little bit of money into the ether. There's a big argument right now. Should we try and fix the whole back catalog and make it future-proof and figure out how to divert all the right royalties to the right people in the back catalog? Or do we say, let's draw a line in the sand and try and fix everything in the future, which is a slightly easier job by, putting it into smart contracts or simplifying it or letting people do direct deals and cut out lots of middlemen. I think we have to do something because if we just carry on debating, should we do A or B for another 5 years, which is how long I've been debating it, and people have been debating much longer than that. And in the interim, you lose an entire generation of artists that were not able to monetize, even though they were creating high quality art. I think music does have intrinsic value. I hope that it will always have intrinsic value. But the idea that you sell a bit of music until you're famous enough to like launch a perfume brand has been around for a long time. So we were kind of putting in the groundwork to destroy music's value way before Spotify came along. I feel lucky to work at Beatport because we are one of the places where people still willingly pay money for music. And I think part of the reason is that we are giving people the opportunity to interact with that music or contextualize it some way. As a DJ, you might be buying your $3 high quality audio files, not because you necessarily like want to own them in the way that somebody's buying like a Harry Styles vinyl, but because you want the ability to remix it and contextualize it, personalize it, and play it out to your audience. It's like all of these places that people want to interact with music, I think is where people will still continue to pay. I think it's difficult to get people to pay now just for a listening experience, unless they're a super fan. But in my realm, where people are more fans of genres and scenes and less a fan of like a specific artist, I think it's the interactivity that is much more easy to monetize.
Super interesting. Yeah, it sounds like what you're saying is that there are certain aspects of the music that have intrinsic value, that like the interactivity of it is where you think that there's some opportunities right now. And that's what you're doing with Beatport, is basically, allowing more interaction with some of these musical assets. And you don't want to live in a world where it's like music has no intrinsic value, and it's just kind of meant to prop up a perfume business. And it's super interesting. I think that the way I look at it is the fact that you can buy the Mona Lisa for $800 million, but you've never been able to purchase Let It Be by the Beatles for more than $1. It makes me think that there's some sort of gap in value and like ownership that's there. Somehow, I think NFTs probably aren't the path, just because the word NFT is so sort of jaded. But I actually think that music is one of those rare places where having some form of digital ownership could make a lot of sense. And it's interesting too, just thinking about what might happen with the future of music royalties and smart contracts and that world. And it sounds like this is a conversation you've actually been like steeped in for 5+ years around this like old model of the royalty collection that's been very complicated, makes it hard to process payments, versus like what might be the new model. Obviously, it's like a very complex, like, can of worms to make that transition or solve it. But where do you fall in terms of like what the path might look like, in terms of if the world appointed you right now to be like, you know what, like we're going to make a clean switch from wherever we currently are to like kind of moving forward. Do you think we'd be better off kind of going all in on making a clean cut from the old way? Or do you think the transition plan, or you seem like you've put some serious thought into this?
I mean, I have put serious thought into it, but I'm always indefinitely the least educated person in the room when I'm having serious roundtable conversations about this. So I try to keep my ideas to myself. I think the simplistic way to look at it is that it would be fairly easy for us to build a system that serves the kind of this single creator, like bedroom producer. Maybe you're using an AI to do your session vocals. Maybe you're using AI to mix and master. And essentially that finished product only has you and maybe one or two other collaborators on there. That's fairly easy to kind of put into the system and track and, get paid out correctly for most scenarios, not all. I think what's sad about that kind of, if everything rolls into that direction, is that you lose out on bands and you lose out on collaboration. And there's so much interesting music out there and interesting artists that by themselves would never have made anything interesting. It was only through collaboration with others that they really found an interesting, unique style of sound. So I think we do need to build a system that works for complex situations, and we can't just encourage everybody to be alone in a bedroom production setup doing stuff by themselves. I think that's a little bit sad. But I dodged the question of do I have the solution, because I don't. I've talked to many, many smart people about how we would do this with, anonymous vaults on the blockchain to share specific bits of information and create verification chains. It's a really, really tough nut to crack. It requires a lot of people to collaborate and share data that are not really set up currently to collaborate. People are very protective over their data, and a true solution would involve a level of collaboration and coordination between the incumbent players that I've not seen happen yet. But I do feel like every year we get a bit closer.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I don't know if you went back 5 or 10 years ago and compared to like where we're at now, it would have been hard to predict kind of like the level of disruption and change with AI and things that are happening. So who knows where we'll be 5 or 10 years from now. But I'm with you. I'm optimistic that if you look at most charts of just like actual quality of life and in poverty, like it doesn't feel like it because we're so aware of the news, like in around, like basically if you look at pretty much every meaningful chart about quality of life, has gotten significantly better, but most of us feel like it's gotten worse than it was in the past for some reason. There's a term for it. But I am also optimistic that things are continuing to get better and that with greater intelligence, we'll be able to solve some of these more complex issues and properly compensate everyone that was involved in the creative process.
For sure. And I think something you said earlier was quite interesting around, you have a piece of art, there's the ability there to spend a lot of money on that art if you care about it. Within music, we've kind of just created this one price band for everybody. And I personally, and I think most people I know, would be willing to spend a lot more on music a year if it was not capped by the service they were using. Not to say that everybody in the world does. And then I remember the first time I met somebody who genuinely didn't care about music. It didn't move them in any way. And I was like, oh my God, you're like an alien. Like I couldn't even imagine my life without music. And I went through this kind of thought exercise and started asking people, how much would you pay to keep music in your life? Like if you think about all the music that you experience day to day, not just, what's on your headphones, but walking through a shop and having something on, on the radio or seeing, the credits to some movie. Like if you were to truly cut out every bit of music in your life, what do you think that would do to your mental health, and what would you pay to bring it back? And usually the numbers were pretty high, because that is a sad world where there's no music in it at all. But we haven't created a system that allows people that really care and connect with music to pay for it. We've just said it's kind of, one size fits all. And I think what we're seeing now is more of a stratification of different fan experiences. Again, Beatport is a niche DSP, so we have a much smaller catalog. We only have about 12 million songs on our catalog, but we have people pay more for that than they pay for Spotify because they're looking for a different type of active, lean-in experience. So I think the more we can recognize that not everyone in the world wants to invest the same amount into music, and yes, there are people, strange people in my opinion, that don't care about it at all and want it to be free. But I think there's a pretty big, category of people that it's really important to them and they would invest in it. So I think those are the people we need to find.
Absolutely. That's a great point. Bringing it back to the Mona Lisa, most people wouldn't spend $800 million to collect a piece of art. And you could even argue it's very subjective. Who's to say that this is worth $800 million? Sort of it has historical significance. We've decided that, we value this thing enough that it's worth it. And I mean, hypothetically, if there was a marketplace that had, sort of verification for music assets, and hypothetically, if there was a one-of-one copy of Let It Be by the Beatles, I wonder how much that would sell for. So in the world, it's the ultimate Beatles fan / investor to own one-of-one. And hypothetically, if they also could potentially resell it, in the marketplace, I wonder what that would go for.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting thought exercise. You're getting into kind of the Wu-Tang Clan, Martin Shkreli kind of thought experiment. Mm-hmm. I've never been as, I've never followed the kind of ownership value conversation quite as closely, because I've always thought of music as more of a sharing exercise and a communal thing, rather than a thing that you put on your wall and tell your friends about. But, there are people that do enjoy that go for ownership. We've done a couple of NFT experiments at Beatport, and it's interesting. The first phase of people that came through were really only about financial investment. They would buy something because there was some hope that in the future it would appreciate in value and they could sell it for more. There wasn't really a connection to the underlying asset. But the second experiment we did was with Disclosure, where they were selling 1,000 variants on unique variants of a song. So you would have a one of one, like you were saying. And that really did kind of cross over from pure financial investors into collectors. And that was an interesting experiment. But yeah, it's still a hard sell, I think, on the NFT front, unless you've got some kind of ongoing value. When it becomes more like a virtual fan club, like when you've got something that unlocks perks over your period of ownership and things like that. But I think there's definitely kind of more to go in the NFT conversation. I think we were talking about rebranding them, right? We were going to start calling them digital collectibles because it was less of a radioactive term than NFT.
Oh man, the term radioactive has significance for me, and I won't go down a rabbit hole to tell why. But it's funny that you used that word. But Helen, this has been a great conversation. Thank you for coming on here and sharing some of your experience and insights as it relates to your background and investments and revenue, as well as coming into the music industry to help independent artists to be able to cut through the noise. And could you share a little bit about, if someone's listening to us right now and they're interested in checking out Beatport, who would be like the ideal candidate to join the platform, and what's the best place for them to go to sign up?
Sure. So we have a bunch of resources available for up and coming artists, small labels. One is that Hype program I mentioned, which is our place on the store for smaller artists and labels. We also have a partnership with DistroKid and TuneCore. So if you are fully DIY and you want to be on the Beatport store, you can distribute to us directly. We also run something called Beatport Next, which is an annual kind of like an accelerator that we run every year for 12 up-and-coming artists that we think are exciting, where we give them extra promo support. Often they are invited to come and play at some of our events like IMS in Ibiza. And we really see if, a year of working intensively with us can get them to the next level. So I would check out all of those initiatives that we've got going on. I think I also shared with you a link to a webinar that we have, which explains exactly like how to get your music in front of a Beatport curator to get it featured on the store. All of our Beatport playlists are human curated. We don't use algorithmic curation. So if you want to get, featured on the store, it's got to go through some human ears. The Beatport store is kind of designed for indie content. We do have major label content on there, but it's kind of a small minority. So everything we do is kind of set up to try and bring visibility to smaller artists, smaller teams, smaller labels, because, DJs are looking for that stuff that's a little bit, away from the mainstream. So check out Beatport.
Super cool. Well, like always, we'll put the links in the show notes for easy access. And Helen, thank you again for being on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.